Hello once again, and welcome to the 15th of our lectures in this series on the foundations of Western civilization. In the previous group of lectures, we talked about the Greek polis. We talked about it as a political and social institution, we talked about its culture, and in our last lecture, as you may recall, we talked about its demise, its internal failure, and then its failure in the face of Macedonian conquest, when Philip II of Macedon conquered the Greeks, and when his son Alexander took over his father's control of the Greeks, and then went off on these vast military campaigns into what had formerly been the Persian Empire. In doing this, Alexander inaugurated a period of history we call the Hellenistic world. Now, this is a world that we generally date from the death of Alexander in 323 BC until the Battle of Actium, when the Romans defeated the last of the great Hellenistic rulers in 31 BC. Basically, in other words, 3 centuries of time, chronologically speaking, following on the classical period of Greek history. In later lectures, we'll see that in the Western Mediterranean, during this Hellenistic period, the Romans are rising to prominence, but that's for later lectures. Right now, we want to focus on the world that Alexander made, or in any case, on the world that followed him. Now, I've used the word Hellenistic. We call this world, from Alexander on, Hellenistic, to differentiate it from the Hellenic. Now, we are inconsistent in doing this because I was telling you a few lectures back that we don't actually refer to the Greeks as Hellenes or their land as Hellas. We call them Greeks and we call their land Greece. We should call them Hellenes, so the period that we have been speaking of in our previous lecture should be the Hellenic period. But now, instead of saying that we're going to talk about the Greekistic period, we talk about the Hellenistic period. So you mustn't ever ask professors to be logical or consistent or coherent. We just confuse those who listen to us. So, Hellenistic, Greek-influenced, Greek-ish, as opposed to Greek proper. Now, it's a period when, in fact, Greek culture became fundamental in the Mediterranean world. The Koine Greek language, Koine in Greek means common. The common language of this Hellenistic world became Greek. Not the highfalutin Greek of the greatest of the Athenian writers, a commoner, more ordinary form, hence the name, but nevertheless it spread very widely. The Greek influence became dominant in, for example, art, in architecture. Greek influences in literature spread very, very widely. Greek philosophy remained dominant, though we're going to see it was changed in some very interesting ways during this Hellenistic period. Now, in Alexander's death, to come first of all to the sort of political shape of this Hellenistic world, let's get a sense of just how it was organized. Who was out there? Who were the players? On Alexander's death, his generals basically, at least 3 of the most important of them, carved up this vast world that he had conquered. You may just recall my having said, excuse me, that Alexander died very young, and he had not made any formal provision, either for how he was going to rule this world, or indeed for what might one day succeed to him. So we don't really know what his plans would have been. What we know is what happened, and that is that his generals carved this world up. Now, one of these, whose name was Antigonus, his descendants are called the Antigonids, took Macedon and the Balkans. Basically, in other words, went back and took the old Macedonian homelands and the Greek peninsula where Philip II and Alexander had made their first conquests. Gradually, slowly, over time, the Greek lands to the south of Macedon sort of broke away and formed a more or less autonomous league, an autonomous realm, sort of under their own supervision, under their own government, but with supervision from the Macedonians to the north. In the Western Balkans, we may just mention, a small kingdom called Epirus emerged. This is something that was actually characteristic of the Hellenistic world, that a fair number of small kingdoms arose midst these great ones. Epirus I'll mention simply because we'll encounter them again in a later lecture as enemies of Rome. I'm not going to detail again and again and again all of these little kingdoms that arose. Basically, there were, as we'll see in just a second, 3 big ones. So the Antigonids formed the first of these big ones. Now, in the lands lying at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, Syria, Palestine, northern Mesopotamia, southern Anatolia, those territories fell to a general by the name of Seleucus. And the dynasty then which he establishes, the Seleucid dynasty. Most of the rulers of the Seleucid dynasty were named either Seleucus or Antiochus. And if those names just ring a bell, you may have encountered them in the very last books of the Hebrew Scriptures, the very last books of the Hebrew Bible. Judas Maccabeus revolted against, for example, these rulers. So they have a kind of a purchase on our attention, quite independent of their position as successors of Alexander the Great. It's worth mentioning one of the other smallish kingdoms that emerged, and this is Pergamum, which emerged in central Anatolia, an area which the Seleucids were unable effectively to dominate, and so the little kingdom of Pergamum arose in central Anatolia. I mention that one because, again, the Romans and the Pergamines will have dealings with each other late in the 2nd century BC. But that is a story for a later day. I just want to forecast that we will come back to this. In Egypt, finally, the last of Alexander's great generals, Ptolemy, marched off to Egypt, took over the land of Egypt, and established a dynasty of rulers there, which persisted until, indeed, 31 BC. The last of the Ptolemies, of course, was the famous Cleopatra, who, it is important to say, was not Egyptian at all, but Macedonian. Now, these various Hellenistic kingdoms, the large ones and the small ones, warred with one another often, were great rivals of one another most of the time, allied with one another occasionally in the face of common threats. For example, later on, in the face of the threat posed by the Romans. What we will see in later lectures is that the Romans marched into the eastern Mediterranean and conquered these Hellenistic kingdoms one by one by one. And it was really the final conquest of these Hellenistic kingdoms that marked the definitive rise of the Roman Empire in the eastern Mediterranean world. All right, so that's basically the political shape of the Hellenistic world. 3 great kingdoms, the Antigonids, the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies, arrayed between and among a series of smaller kingdoms with this rising threat to them of Rome. But it's the cultural and not the political, diplomatic, military history of the Hellenistic world that is really interesting and important to us. And this is what we want to spend the majority of our time talking about. It was a world of great wealth, in part because a sort of a very large, something like free trading zone was generated by these vast conquests of Alexander and his successors. It was a time of the rapid and easy movement of peoples. One of the things very interesting in the sources for this period is how many people from one place wind up prominent, active at any rate, in places very far away. There's an enormous amount of travel, an enormous amount of exchange in this world. It's a time of rapid cultural dissemination. This is a period when we can really see cultures spreading. Now, the great statues themselves are, in fact, some centuries later than the period I'm talking about now. But a very interesting example of this are those spectacular Buddhas that were destroyed in Bamiyan in the year 2001 by the Taliban. The largest of them was arrayed with facial features and with general sort of iconographic details of Central Asia. But the folds of clothing and garments were Greek. The statue was arrayed as if it was a Greek. Somebody who made that statue had certain Greek ideas in mind and blended them with the ideas that were native to that region. Now, there's an example that is poignant for us now because of recent events in world history, but it's a good example of this spread of cultures that was characteristic of the Hellenistic world. It was a time, many think, of great cosmopolitanism. Cosmos polis, of the world as a city, the city as a world, of the spread of cultures, of people taking on the cultures of other people, other places, other times. Now, I think that if we look for a few minutes at the city of Alexandria, we have some very good insights into what this Hellenistic world was like. Alexandria was really, in many ways, a very dynamic, a very creative place during the Hellenistic period. We could turn to other places, but let's use Alexandria as a kind of an example, as a way of thinking our way into this period. The city was founded by Alexander. He founded more than 20 cities, and somewhat immodestly named them after himself, Alexandria. One evidence to his overweening pride, perhaps. This was a city that by 250 BC or thereabouts had probably 500,000 people. By 31 BC, when the Hellenistic world was finally conquered by the Romans, probably 1 million. That's a big city in antiquity. That's a big city in the modern world. Now, it was a city known particularly for its scholarship. It was really thought of in a place called the Museum. Now, museum is a Latin word. Museon is a Greek word. The Museon is the home of the Muses. Now, the Muses were the poetic names, the allegorical names assigned by the Greeks to each of the branches of knowledge. You think of Calliope, the muse of music, for example. So the Museon was the great house where the Muses lived, but they lived there in the sense that they were studied there, that they were held dear there. You see, that they were analyzed there. Now, the museum eventually became quite famous, really, as a place where all branches of knowledge were studied. And this began to produce a new kind of person. This began to produce a very different kind of intellectual tradition in the West. Now, I don't want to say we have a 180-degree turn. What I say is we will now generate a tension that I dare say is with us still. The people who did this study were learned, they were professional, they were enormously scholarly. They were no longer actually great civic figures. One of the interesting things about the figures that we talked about in Athens, for example, whether we're thinking of a Socrates or a Plato, whether we're thinking of the playwrights or the historians, these were people who functioned in an urban environment, spoke to that urban environment, absorbed that urban environment into their work, spoke back to that urban environment in their work. They were very much anchored in that world. Now in the museum, we have scholars, people who study without necessarily being fully engaged with their world. Culture was an object of study. It wasn't a part of daily life. Learned and elitist scholars began, for example, for the first time to define literary canons, to decide what criteria of excellence marked those works that should be remembered, should be studied, should be analyzed, and those which were forgettable. They began, for example, to study the various works that existed, to collect many manuscripts of them, for instance, to compare the text in order to prepare what we would call standard editions, to begin to make definitive editions of texts. They began to try to define taste, to try to define standards, to sort of say, well, this is what you ought to think, this is what you ought to know. Previously, these kinds of things, for instance, were, again, very much more a part of civic culture. We could say, for instance, to take but one example, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were in very many ways part of the paideia. Paideia in Greek means the leading up, the training up, the drawing up of a youth. All right? Now, it wasn't as if the youths were sent home at night to memorize sort of 20 lines of the Iliad per night, and over the course then of a few years through their adolescence, they had the whole thing memorized. But it was something that they heard recited, they heard talked about, the stories were told, the messages were told, the morals were registered, you see, of these great books, and they simply became a part of the patrimony of the Greeks. In Alexandria, it would be much more common to study the language, to study the diction, to study the syntax, to study the vocabulary, you see, to look at the Iliad in a very different kind of way. So we're seeing, in a way, the emergence of the ivory tower intellectual. The intellectual who, in a very real way, is divorced from his society, or at least is perceived that way. This is, in a way, a world also that exemplifies the first faint beginnings of what C.P. Snow described in his very famous book, The Two Cultures. Snow was an Oxford Don, and a generation ago, a little over that now, he wrote a book, The Two Cultures. And what he was really talking about is the culture of the arts, the humanities, and so on the one hand, and the culture of science on the other. And he's talking about how in the modern world these two things have become divorced from one another. And there's very often a sort of an inability to study them, you see. You go to any college or university, and if you think about liberal arts, people think, oh, that means you're going to read English and study art and so on. It doesn't mean you're going to study calculus and chemistry. Now, we're going to ask why that should have been the case in some later lectures. For the moment, it is worth pointing out that at Alexandria, we basically see science. Philosophy actually remains very much in Athens. What we are beginning to see is this division between what we would think of as the sciences and what we would think of as the arts. Now, the ideal, for example, in the academy and in the lyceum, Plato's school and Aristotle's school, had been to unify, to integrate these bodies of knowledge. Think of Aristotle, to go no further, and his interest in the world of natural science going back to Thales, and his ability to develop a whole philosophical approach to things based on his understanding of the natural world. Slowly but surely, however, that begins to change. That begins, these two trends, these two traditions, these two possibilities of knowing begin to divorce one from the other. And I think there has been some considerable tension throughout the history of Western civilization since Hellenistic times addressed to the problem. Are they separate and distinct, or can they again be brought together? I think we've probably made a concerted effort to bring them together, but we have not succeeded very well. If you stop and think, for example, of the distribution requirements or the general education requirements, however you want to describe them, in most colleges and universities, you take some English, you take some language, you take some history, you take some math, you take some science. There's still this idea that to be liberally educated, you have to know this range of things. And then there's also the idea that if I'm interested in this, I don't want to do that. You see? So this break that comes in the Hellenistic period has been a durable one. Now, the Hellenistic period was indeed important for a number of scientific breakthroughs. If I'm going to say that Alexandria was a place where science was important, let's have a few examples of this kind of thing. Euclid, for example, around about 300, formulated the rules of geometry, the rules of plane geometry, the essential rules, the essential formulae, the essential theorems for explaining sort of plane surfaces. Archimedes, another of the important Hellenistic era scientists, 287 to about 212 BC. Now, Archimedes was sort of a Mr. Fix-It. He's famous for making all kinds of gadgets. But actually, there's something else rather interesting about Archimedes. This is the emergence of experimental science. This is the first time we really begin concretely to see something like experimental science. The attempt by experimentation to arrive at a point and then to be able to confirm a point, a theory, an argument, an idea, a mechanical contraption, whatever it might be, to be able to confirm it by repeated demonstration, by repeated testing. Before this time, now, Aristotle, of course, and the traditions behind him, had said, you must observe closely. But there had not really been the experimental dimension. This is added in the Hellenistic period. Aristarchus, around 275 BC, articulated for the first time the heliocentric theory. Center's no problem. Helios is Greek for sun. He put the sun at the center of the universe. Now, that's a rather interesting thing for an earthly person to do, I suppose. We now know, of course, that the sun isn't actually the center of the universe, but we do think of the sun as the center of our solar system, which is merely one part of a large galaxy, which is merely one part of a much larger universe. Now, that astronomical lore was not yet available in Hellenistic times, and as we'll have occasion to see, very near the end of our course of lectures, as late as the 17th century, fellows like Galileo could get themselves in trouble over this heliocentric theory. It had not, in fact, triumphed. It was not regnant. A man by the name of Eratosthenes, 225 BC, by process of quite simple intuition, calculated the circumference of the Earth and managed to do it to a remarkably accurate degree. Ptolemy, the Ptolemies, of course, were the rulers of Egypt, but there were members of the family, of course, who never got to be the ruler, so they sort of went off and pursued other interests. One of these, Ptolemy, who lived from 127 to 48 BC, really began to systematize astronomical information. He began to collect enormous amounts of material that had been observed of the heavens above us, and he began for the first time to try to create a theory that would explain planetary motion. I mean, this quite simply is that if you collect, this problem is occasioned by the fact, if you collect a lot of information about the way the world works out there and the way the planets are going around out there, you notice that there's something slightly odd. They're not all moving at exactly the same speed, at exactly the same order, in exactly the same place. They seem to kind of move around. How can this be? Well, one of the things Ptolemy recognized was that we were going to need more sophisticated mathematical models to explain what was going on. And he, for the first time, sort of introduces mathematics into astronomy. Now, there were some very elementary errors or misunderstandings excuse me, in Ptolemy's time. He thought orbits were circular. It was a very long time later they realized that orbits were elliptical. So it's early in the 17th century again that Johannes Kepler can do the mathematics of astronomy as we know it now, you see. Ptolemy made some pretty remarkable steps for his time. So that's the kind of thing that we see as characteristic, perhaps, of the culture of the museum. Now, elsewhere in the Hellenistic world, we also see the emergence of some new literary forms. Some of the older Greek forms persisted, History continued to be written, poetry continued to be written, and so on. But we find something new, for instance, in the Argonautica, the journey of Argo, a story written perhaps 295 BC or thereabouts by Apollonius of Rhodes. Now, this is a work that is on epic scale, but it's not an epic. It's an adventure story, and his Argonauts go off in search of the Golden Fleece. It's a mythical story, it's an adventure story, it's quite an engaging tale. It's not very long, it's easy to read, it's great fun. It's a cutting story, it's a clever story. We're presented in it with a number of anomalies. There is a great love interest in the story, Jason and Medea. It's also the case that Jason is a sort of a big, strong, brash, spontaneous kind of fellow who forever is getting himself in trouble. And it's Medea who always is getting him out of trouble and is always figuring out exactly how to prevail in his quest for the Golden Fleece. Now, that's in a way the old brains and brawn issue that we've seen in the Greek world before, but now the woman has the brains and the man has merely the brawn. Perhaps it's always so. Now, it's a story on epic scale. I mean, there are monsters and ships travel long distances and amazing things happen. But in a classic epic, you'd have had verse, not prose. This is a prose work. You wouldn't have had a love story told. It wouldn't have been told in sort of common and ordinary language. And there's nothing universalizing about this story. This is entertainment. This was pleasant diversion. You're not supposed to put the Argonautica down and feel that you have grown morally or ethically. You've been entertained. Menander, who lives from perhaps 342 or thereabouts to 293, maybe as late as 289 BC, is the great writer of comedies in the Hellenistic world, or at least the one whose name we know best. We have a problem here. One of his plays survives completely, one alone. We know the names, again, remember as with the Greek tragedians, we know the names of a number of other plays. We even have fragments of a few of them. But what we have is one play in toto. It's called The Curmudgeon. It's a story about an angry old man. And it is very funny. And it's full of sort of improbably funny circumstances. But again, it is full of ordinary domestic concerns. It's full of daily life. This is, in a way, I Love Lucy. This is the sitcom. This is the remote ancestor of the situation comedy. This is not high comedy like Aristophanes, where humor, perhaps even ridicule, certainly satire, is used to poke fun at, to make comments about great events of the day. Menander is just funny. You read him, you learn, oh, maybe there is a kind of a point. I mean, good heavens, every time we watch a sitcom, there is a point, I suppose, of some kind in them, but they're pretty simple, they're pretty homely, they're not the kind of thing that are ever going to be carved in stone and put on the front of a building. All right? So we also begin to see entertainment as escape. And that'll take us to the philosophies of the Hellenistic world. The two great ones, of course, were Stoicism and Epicureanism. Philosophies that specialists in these areas have called therapeutic. Therapeutic because they were philosophies designed to make you feel better. They were philosophies for people who lived in a world whose values and institutions seemed somehow to have failed. Things seemed to have gone desperately wrong. The polis was gone, the world of the citizen was gone, vast empires had arisen, impersonal government had arisen. From all accounts in the literature of the time, alienation was common. And the focus began, therefore, for philosophical writers to shift to ethics. How can I cope with this world? How can I live? That somehow now seemed a lot more important than what is the world made of? What are the grand principles that underlie everything? Now, I don't want to imply that no one was thinking about those questions, but fundamentally, thought was moving in slightly different directions. So, the most famous, then, of these philosophies, Stoicism and Epicureanism. Let's begin with a few words about Stoicism. Stoicism takes its rise with Zeno. Zeno lived in Athens, 335 to 263 BC. He taught more or less in the open at the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, near the Athenian Agora in Athens. So funnily enough, we ought really to speak of Zenoism or something like that, but we talk of Stoicism, which literally means porchism. Odd word, that. He falls very much in the tradition of Plato and Aristotle. He believes that knowledge is possible. He absolutely believes that. He believes there are things we can know. He believes it's necessary to equate knowledge with virtue. Now, you'll recall perhaps that Plato and Aristotle had both said the same thing, that knowledge could be equated with virtue. Zeno believed that there was a kind of a divine reason that permeated all creation, that lay behind everything, that there was a point, a purpose, a law. Think for just a moment of Pythagoras and his theorem, discovering, in a sense, one law that appears to operate in all of nature. Well, by extension, that kind of thinking suggests that there are laws finally behind everything. Virtue consists, therefore, in becoming acquainted with this divine reason, putting oneself into harmony with its laws and with its rules, accepting these propositions as necessary and benevolent. Stoics very often use the image of the theater. We should know our roles and play our roles. We should accept the roles that are assigned to us, but we should learn them very well. This was also a way of thinking that over time would give rise to what we think of as natural law. When Thomas Jefferson speaks of the laws of nature and of nature's God, he is speaking in a way that a Stoic would have spoken about these laws that exist in the nature. We hold certain truths, he said, to be self-evident. They are writ into the universe. They don't exist because a legislature made them or a king made them or somebody wrote a book about them. One has then a moral duty to learn the laws of nature and to live in accord with them. To do so would bring happiness. If I understood how the universe worked and I behaved as if I understood that, I would be happy. Were I happy, I would not be distressed. You see the therapeutic dimension? Pain or stress that exists in any individual, that exists in any society, are a result of misunderstanding, of not possessing knowledge. But pain and distress themselves are not final and not destructive. Even death, you see, is natural, not to be feared, but to be embraced. We think of the apathy of the Stoic sage. Now, if we think of the word apathy, that's not a very pleasant word. We wouldn't want to be called apathetic. Stoic apathy does not mean, I don't care. Stoic apathy means, I am beyond all pain. I am unperturbed. I understand the way the world works. I have accepted it. Suicide is even permitted, curiously, as a form of happiness. If the pain becomes too great, we can escape. Stoicism taught that all visible differences in the world are illusory and accidental. Everyone, finally, is like everyone else. We are all equally, essentially. Oh, not by the way we see ourselves out there in the world, but fundamentally, we are all alike. Now let's turn for a moment to Epicureanism. Epicureanism takes its name from Epicurus, who lives from 341 to 270 BC, and who also taught in Athens. Epicureanism was perhaps less influential in later years than Stoicism was, but it was very, very important in antiquity, and we have to be very careful not to imagine, not to think, not to embrace the caricature of Epicureanism that is the common understanding of, the common reaction to the word itself. The aim of philosophy, according to the Epicureans, was happiness or pleasure. Now that's old, that's exactly what Aristotle said. The point of living well is to be happy. But this did not mean the hedonism that we often now associate wrongly with Epicureanism. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. That is not ancient Epicureanism. Epicurus defined happiness as an absence of pain from the body and of trouble from the soul. His philosophy was austere in the extreme. Pleasure was equated with renunciation. Epicurus urged withdrawal from the world, avoidance of stress, avoidance of anguish, avoidance of all those things, too much food, too much love, whatever it might be that would bring you stress, that would bring you anguish. It's sensible, the Epicureans taught, to desire only those things in moderation that will bring happiness. Only those things that are attainable. Don't go after things you can't get. It'll make you unhappy. It'll make too much stress. Well, these Hellenistic philosophies were going to be influential for the Romans. They were going to be influential for all of those who came after. Stoicism, perhaps, a bit more than Epicureanism. The Hellenistic world, again, leaves us this fundamental foundational basis for the spread of Greek culture. Now, on that foundation, things were built very largely because the Romans conquered this Hellenistic world and conquered its culture. You may remember in an earlier lecture, I spoke of captive Greece, taking her captor captive. This is the world that the Romans captured. Tutte le strade portano a Roma, say our Italian friends. All roads lead to Rome. And our next lecture will take us to the Eternal City.